So tank questions. These are questions that have been on the Tank Club Discord this week. So I thought we would go over the answers to these questions and kind of explain some things about tank stuff. So these are questions people want to know the answer to. So I guess we'll start at the top. If you've got any questions, let me know in the chat. I'll answer those as well. I'll prioritize those and then we'll go through the list of stuff that's here. So there's a couple of things that might be interesting to some people. But here we go. So the first question is, what's the average uptime of PA on an off tank in VAS plus 2? Out of curiosity. I'm on console, so unfortunately don't have access to the stats like PC. So running PA in VAS plus 2 on the off tank is a tricky thing to do. Because most groups, well pretty much all groups, won't be quick enough to kill the mini bosses or be able to kill the main boss fast enough to skip killing the mini bosses. So like the times where you get a really good PA uptime is when you don't have to kill the mini bosses, or maybe you only have to kill one of them, or you only have to kill them once. In those situations, you've got more time to get PA on the group. If that's not the case, if you're having to restack the ads 3, 4, 5 times to be killed, it's not worth using PA. You might as well not bother because you're running around so much, it's not even worth using it. Now, in my most recent Immortal Redeemer clear that I did on the Necro off tank, we managed to get a 91% PA uptime, and that was on myself. And then what that meant was that I was keeping a really good PA uptime, but on my group, depending on which kind of way I was running and stacking, it varied the uptime. So I wasn't in a situation where I was able to stand next to my group just spamming it, but I still managed to keep a good 45% on some people. I think the lowest was like in the 30s, so it wasn't bad. But at the same time, there are kind of better gear you could potentially run. So in that situation, I was running PA and War Machine. Not ideal for newer tanks. Not ideal for most tanks, really. Using a medium armor set in a really high damage situation, when you're getting hit by 2 mini bosses and you're getting hit by the lightning damage from St. Ohms, it can be really difficult. So I would suggest really just dropping PA from VAS altogether and using something like Sax Champion with War Machine. That would probably net you a much better time. Only start bringing in the PA when you're actually really, really super kind of experienced at VAS plus 2 off tanking, and then bring in PA because you're probably going to have more time to actually activate on your group. You're going to understand when to use it. Like as you're running past your group to stack a mini boss, then you cast it. So I don't know what the average uptime would be for PA, but I'm going to imagine it's going to be extremely low, judging by how people use it and judging by trials where they're easier. VAS plus 2 for the off tank is quite difficult, so I would imagine those kind of uptimes are not going to be very good. It's probably to the point where it's not even worth using PA for most groups in VAS plus 2. Okay, does anybody know what abilities drop block besides the first cast of Stone Giant? So this is quite an easy one to answer really, because each skill will tell you essentially if it's going to drop you block or not. Because when it says cast time and it's a channeled skill, when it says it's a channel and it says like however long, any skill that's a channeled skill will drop you block and everything else won't. So like for example, the first cast of Stone Giant will drop you block. It's a channel. It takes a second to channel it. It takes a second to channel Dark Deal. But skills that have like a cast time, so like for example, Igneous Shield might have a 2 second cast time, but it's not got a channel time, so you can cast it while blocking. And it's essentially 95% of the skills that you're going to use as a tank aren't going to drop you block. They're block castable. The only 2 tank skills that drop you block that you actually really need are Stagger and Dark Deal. They're the only 2 actual tank skills that are going to drop you block. There are some other kind of skills that might drop it, but they're not skills that you would often use for a tank, so it's not really worth mentioning them because you wouldn't typically use them. So those are the only 2 skills that really as a tank are going to affect you by dropping your block. General question for Baneful Mark as a DK execute tank in VCR Plus: is it better to have more health or as low health as possible? Since Green Dragonblood heals for 36% of missing health, what would be better, more or less health? So, interesting question. Now, Green Dragonblood will heal for a higher percentage based on the amount of max health that you're missing. However, this is kind of a unique environment where your healing is nerfed by, I think, is it 90%? You get a 90% healing debuff. So you want your health to be kind of as low as possible in that situation, because you don't want to have to heal up to 45, 50k health if someone has got a 90% healing debuff, because it doesn't work. So for Cloud Rest Plus, the absolute maximum you want to have is 40k health, and that's fully buffed. Like, that's with the Warden, that's with everything, like your food, everything. When you are maxed out, you don't want to be more than 40k. Now, there are ways to do that. Obviously, you definitely don't want to use Triune Jewelry. You definitely don't want to use Healthy Jewelry. You definitely don't want to use kind of gear sets that might give you an extra health bonus if you can avoid them. Things that are good to do are running infused magicka pieces of like gear. Not using any health enchants on your gear. No tri-stat on your gear. So I personally have a separate set of gear just for Cloud Rest. I have a divine set of gear that's enchanted with magicka on the small pieces and infused tri-stat on the big pieces. And when I use that setup with infused magicka recovery jewelry, I'm sitting at somewhere like 37k max health. And that's absolutely fine for that environment. I don't need less than that, really. You don't want to go like too low. This is the thing. People say about going to like 32, 33k health, and you're really risking like a problematic situation there, because if you've got to do the portal and you've got to try and keep yourself alive, you don't want to have super low health. You don't want to take 2 light attacks and be dead. So you have got to still kind of play with a bit of health. You want to have over 35k and under 40k for most people, I would say. And that kind of gives you a bit of comfort where you're not too low that you're going to almost be getting one shot from a light attack, because you don't want to be blocking that much in Cloud Rest either. You don't want to be having to intensely block for long periods of time. But yeah, for Baneful Mark, it doesn't matter what class it is, whether it's a DK or something else, 35 to 40k is your limit on health, and that's fully buffed out. And that's what I'd suggest. That's what I go with, and like I say, to get to that point, using magicka enchants and things like that is a big help as well. You can also just take off your Tireless Guardian CP. Just unslot it for that particular trial. Some people like to switch food. I personally don't. I don't ever switch food, and I've never had a problem, because I like to have the health recovery from Bewitched Sugar Skulls, because my way of doing Cloud Rest is stacking health recovery. I stack health recovery. Now, to do that, I need Bewitched Sugar Skulls, so I don't ever drop that. I keep that food on, and I just take off my Tireless Guardian, or like I say, I use a different set of gear that's just for Cloud Rest. So there are a few ways around this. You just got to pick whichever one suits you best. Next question from the Tank Club Discord. We've got somebody a new tank. So I went Torug's Sword and Board as my 5-piece. Can anyone recommend what trait and enchant I need for the weapon? And if I'm using a Sword and Board, do I need my back bar to be a Torug staff? If so, what trait and enchant for this? Also, the staff, would it be Ice or Inferno? You're assuming Ice. So, if you go with a Torug's set, you have to double bar Torugs, because let's say you use a Torug staff, but you don't use a Torug's front bar. You put down Blockade. When you're on your front bar, it doesn't, like, you don't have a 5-piece of Torugs equipped, so it won't proc the Torug's enchant. When you switch to your back bar, it will. But if your enchant lasts 4 seconds and will re-proc on cooldown from your Blockade, then obviously you need to make sure that both bars have got a full Torug's active. In terms of a Sword and Board trait and enchant, it's kind of up to you. Some people like to use different things. So for your enchant, some people like to use Weakening, but at the same time, I personally have never used a Weakening enchant in probably the last 2 years or so. Now, the reason for that is because on a one-handed weapon, it's only got half the value. So there's not really a lot of value to using it, and a lot of the times, healers will use a Weakening enchant. Now, if you actually look at the Weakening enchant and see how much damage it actually reduces, it's very, very small amounts, so it's not really that worth it. Yeah, so you've got a few options. Weakening is a decent option, but Weakening has a very small effect, a very small impact. If you are using Weakening, you're going to want to pair that up with Infused, because Infused will increase the size of the Weakening enchant, but also Because it's already halved in value, you don't want to. It's going to be a real small enchant if you don't use infused. So infused is typically the best trait for a one-hander. Now, there are situations where you might not use that. So if you don't really, for like more top-end players who are trying to push ultimate, you're going to use decisive. So decisive is a great trait because it gives every time you gain ultimate, it's got a chance to proc one extra ultimate. So that happens a lot as a tank. You're going to have minor heroism. You're going to be blocking attacks. You're going to be gaining ultimate. You gain a lot of ultimate. There's a lot of skills that tanks use that give extra ultimate. So you've got a good chance to be proccing a lot of decisive trait on your front bar. That is definitely something you should consider doing. And the only time you really need infused is if you really want that extra bit of weakening. If you want that extra bit of stamina. So my preference for front bar enchant is typically just absorb stamina. Next patch, in the Waking Flame patch, you could use a tri-stat, the prismatic weapon enchant. That's going to give you all 3 returns of resources. So you're going to get magic health and stamina back. If you're going to use it on an infused weapon, it's actually quite decent. It's better than using if you just use an absorb stamina enchant, that gives less total stats than what the tri-stat will give. So that is kind of good. I'm looking forward to trying that out on the live server and some trials and see if it's nice. But yeah, it's kind of wide open. I would go for probably one of those 3. I don't really see much value in any other enchants. In the past, people have used charge shot glyphs and things like that. That is not something that we do anymore because off balance and things like that are not useful for a tank to be proccing. So you don't need that kind of thing. So absorb stamina. Flame glyph is another one. If you're using in Kratos and you don't have a fire skill, using a flame glyph is another option. Now you can use that on an infused weapon because it reduces the cooldown that you can re-proc the enchant. That can sometimes be a good or a bad thing though, because if you proc it at the wrong time, you activate your flame enchant and then there's a little bit of a cooldown and then you proc it again, but you've lost some in Kratos uptime, it's a bit more difficult to manage. So flame enchant, absorb stamina or magicka or tri-stat, or a weaken enchant, those are the 3 that are really worth using. And then in terms of the trait, it's only really decisive or infused that are worth using. Some people have been using charged with caltrops and things like that, trying to proc the sundered effect for minor breach. Doesn't seem to have a very good uptime when you do that, so it's not really worth it. So those are the ones I would go with. In terms of the back bar, trait and enchant, infused crusher. 9 times out of 10, your back bar weapon is always going to be an ice staff, infused crusher. Ice staff because ice staff is a tank weapon. It provides damage mitigation. It reduces your cost of block. It gives you a damage shield. It does a lot of stuff. There's some good skills that you need as well that work better when you use a frost staff. And then infused crusher because you just put down blockade, you make sure you refresh it on cooldown, and that will just continue to proc crusher 100% of the time. The only other trait and enchant you might use is a charged frost, and that is only in real specific situations. I would only start using that at the kind of upper areas of the game where you know mechanics, you do really well. When you want to start working in minor brittle into your groups, you will have to use a double frost staff to get good uptimes, and in that case, then you start using charged weapon. You start to use a frost glyph as well to kind of proc that effect, that chilled effect, and that minor brittle. Another thing you might use is you might use a shot glyph if you're using elemental catalyst on an infused weapon. In these situations where you're not using an infused crusher, somebody else has to. So when you don't use infused crusher, you've got to make sure there's a healer using it or another tank. So that is something that you need to organise with people. You don't just go away and start using a charged frost staff. You start doing that if you've discussed it with your group and you're going to be in charge of brittle, and they're going to take over doing that infused crusher. So you have to kind of look at that and figure things out with your group. Okay, next question is: Vet AA hard mode solo tank first time. Should I hold everything on the boss or at range? It's going to be a pickup group. Should I just get a second tank to be safe? So, there is a safe way to just solo tank it. And this is on the website, on the tankclub.com. I have got a build for Vet AA hard mode that is designed to be essentially a cheat code for the AA hard mode. And the way that it works is you use immovable potions with some infused jewelry, potion boost glyphs. What happens is every 45 seconds you've got 33 seconds where you can't be stunned because you use an immovable potion and it procs the immovable effect, which means you can't be stunned. Now what that is good for is when you're struggling for sustain because you've got 4 axes hitting you, you've got time to drop block and heavy attack. So what all of this means is you stay stacked on the boss, you keep taunt of 1 axe. You only have to taunt 1 axe, and sometimes you don't even need to do that. As long as you taunt the main boss, the axes usually stay aggroed onto you. So you do that. You use this potion, and then you make sure when your potion is kind of at that 30-second mark, you start to block. You make sure you do 15 seconds of blocking, and then you can do 30 seconds of not blocking. And as long as you still on the boss, you're going to get healing. You're going to get resources. You're going to have everything there. And it makes hard mode really easy as well. Another thing that it really helps as well is when the ads drop down when the reflections drop down, they can stun you, can't they? So when they drop down, they create an AoE on the floor. That knocks you back. Now, if you're using this particular jewelry setup, you're not going to lose aggro of the axes because you're not going to get stunned by them. You're also not going to get stunned when the ads spawn in. So you can time it. When you can see that AoE, you can pop your immovable potion and then make sure that you don't get knocked back. Because what happens is, because you only need to taunt 1 axe to keep aggro of all of them, what this means is when you get stunned, you actually lose aggro of all the axes because they're not actually taunted. And when you become stunned, the axes will go away from you. So this particular setup just makes it super easy because you don't have to block, you got good sustain, you don't get stunned. It's fantastic. So if you are going to do the AA hard mode as a solo tank, definitely give that a try. It works fantastic. Immovable potions, infused jewelry, potion boost. Not cooldown, potion boost, because it increases the effect. We're not trying to reduce the potion cooldown because then you're going through potions like crazy. You want to increase the duration of the effect. So increase the duration of the immovable effect. If you want to play it safe though, you could use a second tank. Second tank would be playing it safe. You don't even need a second tank though. If you just have a tank to take the atronarchs, you could just have a damage dealer with a range taunt. That does the same as what an off tank would do, basically. Dumb question. How do you tab target on console? So, what you have to do is, when you tab target an enemy on console, it's the right analog stick, you point your cursor at the enemy, and you hold it in for a second. And when you hold it in, you don't need to hold it for a long time, but you hold it in for just a quick second. So you hold it in, and then you let go. And that should put like a white border around the enemy, and that's a tab target. So there we go. So that's tab targeting. Now tab targeting is sometimes works good. A lot of the time doesn't actually make that much difference. So you have to be like, you can't always, it's not 100% reliable when you tab target an enemy it's going to do the thing you want it to do and it's going to focus on that one enemy. Sometimes it won't. So you have to be careful with tab targeting. Okay. Next question we got is, hey guys, I just finished my first prog run on VSS hard mode fire and I struggled with pulling the flame atros a bit. For some reason, something always seemed to be in my line of sight and I couldn't get the atros in time. I'm on PS4, can't really do much regarding add-ons and stuff. Do you have any tips for this? Well, yes, we do. So, if you're trying to do Yolnahkrin hard mode and it's like one of your first goes or you're like very, very new to it, my personal preference is to rely on Swarm Mother to practice getting the enemies in quickly. Now, the reason for this is there are 2 different kinds of things you've got to worry about in that situation. You've got one, being underneath the dragon and the damage that happens under there. You've got the mechanics that you're dealing with. You've got the boss that can swipe you out and you can chain in the atros to a bad location under there that are too close to the group. So I think using Swarm Mother is a great way to start off the learning process of doing this strategy. And the reason for that is you can just focus on the first few times you do it, focus on positioning, making sure you're in the correct place, right underneath the belly of the dragon, kind of in front of the feet, but not between the legs. You don't want to go too far back because then the boss will wing slap you out. So there is that. Once you've kind of got the positioning nailed down, then start working in a chain. Now, to chain the enemies from under the dragon, you need to be in first person. So especially for console, this is mostly important for console. I've played on console myself and I play using a controller. I have to go in first person or I'm not able to chain the atros. So the atros spawn in, I range taunt them, I roll underneath the dragon, I go underneath into the location I need to be. I'm in first person, I chain to the left, I chain to the right, and I don't need to look for the atros because I already know that where they are. They spawn in the same place every time. And as long as you range taunt them and then roll under the boss, they always are in the exact same place every time you chain them. So you don't need to even be able to see them, you don't need to know where they are, you don't have to do anything. You just know you have to chain, pointing your cursor slightly to the left and then slightly to the right, and it works every time. Using Swarm Mother will give you that that chance to make a mistake, because if you get the range taunt, you roll under the dragon, you hold block, that will chain something in, but then you can practice trying to chain the other one. You can chain one and Swarm Mother brings in the other. So then you're not going to fail because you're still getting better and practicing, but without all the like failure of being able to chain them in, because you've got Swarm Mother helping you out, and it's like you fail safe, but you can also still practice chaining while you're under there to make sure you can actually get them chained and they're in the right place and you're in the right place and everything's in the right place. So that would be my suggestion, and just remember to go into first person when you're under the dragon, because if you don't, you'll just keep chaining the dragon's neck and the dragon's head, and you'll be chaining away at the dragon and you won't be able to chain in the atros. So first person, Swarm Mother, give those a try, and then try and advance and just keep practicing, get your positioning down, and then practice the chaining in. Okay. Anyone have details about the damage shield applied from casting wall with a frost staff? There is information about this. You have to slot element of blockade. You have to slot that, and you have to then look at the skill on your equipped bar. If you scroll to the skill in your actual skill line, you won't see the effect that having a frost staff has. You have to have a frost staff. You have to be using a frost staff. You have to equip the skill, and then you have to go at your main. You have to be hovering on your main bar and look at the skill that way. You can't look at it in the list of skills. It doesn't work. And when you do that, it will tell you the information about the shield. So it is a projectile damage shield that gives about a 12k damage shield. So 2 projectiles only. So it gives it to 6 people, and you cast blockade, 6 people get the shield, and then that protects them to, like, for 12k, or around about 12k. And it's kind of good. Like, it was really good in VHOF. So in the last boss of VHOF, in the execute phase, you can just spam element of blockade, and it's giving people a damage shield, and it's absorbing a load of the damage, because that's a projectile damage. So there are situations where it's really good. Another thing, when a shield gets absorbed, if people have got the last passive in the destruction staff skill line, they will get magicka back when a shield is consumed. So when you put down blockade and a shield is consumed by that frost shield that you've given them, they will receive like magicka back. So it also is a little bit of a sustain tool in situations where there is projectile damage. How do I go about learning to use stagger as a DK? Are there any add-ons that helps to track it? I'm guessing at first you just use it when you have all the other bits already running. So when you want to start using stagger, there's a few things that you have to think of. Yes, you do have to have everything else active and running. So you do have to have your blockade down, your taunt, you do have to have your buffs up, you do have to have everything running. Then you start working in your stagger. However, to be able to keep up stagger, you need to recast Stone Giant, the skill, every 3 actions. So let's say you press taunt, bar swap, stagger, bar swap, blockade, bar swap, stagger. Like, you've got to press it every 3 to 4 actions to maintain it, because it's only a 5-second skill. It only lasts for 5 seconds. So you've got to be recasting it every 4th action. So, and 1 action is a bar swap or a light attack or a heavy attack or a skill. If you use something, you've got to be recasting stagger every 3 to 4 actions. So it's not possible to like get all of your buffs running and then start stagger. You want to kind of make sure you got taunt, make sure you got something else. Start off your stagger, because you have to work it into a bit of a rotation. It makes DK tanking turn into like a thing where you actually have to do a kind of a rotation like a damage dealer to maintain it, because you're having to put like down a blockade and then do that and then do that and then bar swap, stagger, and you've got to cast it so often. Now, one of the problems people have with stagger is the fact that the first cast of stagger drops block, and then it creates some balls, some like rocks around your character, And then when it drops, like, you've got, like, when it drops your block, you've got to kind of understand that you've only got a certain amount of casts, and then you're going to have to recast again. So what you have to kind of think about doing is to learn how to do stagger. A good way of doing it is to, every time you cast stagger, drop your block. Every time you cast Stone Giant, drop your block. Right? Now, this might sound a bit crazy, but if you get into the habit of only casting stagger when it's safe to drop block for a second, you'll never get caught out with the initial stomp that drops your block, because you're always used to dropping your block every time you cast it. So get into the habit of doing stagger and dropping block at the same time. That way, you'll never get hit with a one-shot because you weren't prepared, because you dropped block at a bad time. You just need to time it in that way and practice doing it that way, and then you'll be used to it. And then you can maybe work block back in where you block more often, potentially. But if you're not comfortable of dropping block to do that, then obviously you're not ready to use stagger yet, because stagger is going to drop your block. In terms of an add-on, there is an add-on just called stagger, I believe. I don't know if it's still there or not. I personally am not a huge fan of it, because the in-game buff tracker, so if you go into your settings, there is actually a tracker in the game, a buff tracker. Now, if you turn that on, for me, that's the best way of tracking it, because what happens is, when you cast stagger, you can see the stacks of how many stacks of stagger you've got on the enemy, and it'll also give you a timer. So then you can see when you need to recast it from that. You can also see on your own bar how long your Stone Giant is going to last. And if there's no Stone Giant there, you know that you've got no cast left and it's going to drop your block. So I personally find it easier just to use the in-game buff tracker than I find to actually use the add-on. And if you track it that way, it seems to be a much more simple method of doing it rather than using an add-on. Because I find the add-on really confusing, because it lights up in different colours, it has different numbers, and there's like numbers for how many things. I don't know, it just seems more complicated than it needs to be. The in-game buff tracker is already perfect for doing the job of tracking stagger. Did that already. I'm working on doing more vet trials. I have a bunch of gear. I need to transmute / enchant. I looked at the guides online on the website, and it looked like those both vary for each trial. Is that true? Or is there a go-to enchant / transmute that would work for most situations? So, on the website, we have builds for every trial, every situation, every boss fight, every ad pull, everything. Everything. There's about 300 builds on the Tankler website, because you've got, like, if you've got a trial, for example, VHoff has got 6 builds, like 1 for each boss, and then 1 for the ad pulls. It's also got a beginner set, like a beginner build for VHoff. It's also got a console build for VHoff, and it's got a build for every single class, all 6 classes. There's an absolute load of builds on the site, because we can combine it in that kind of way. You've got to pick and choose what's going to work best for you. So you might not want to choose to change your gear every boss fight, so you don't have to. You go for the static build. If you're newer to the trial, you're going to take the beginner build or something that's more simple to use. If you want to really optimize it, then you are going to use different traits, different gear, different enchants, and all that kind of stuff, because that is how you optimize the trial. But you don't have to optimize the trial if you don't want to. You can just run a set build if your group is kind of at that stage where switching gear every fight isn't as important and integral. It's more about the mechanics and the fight and that kind of stuff. So it will vary. In terms of a go-to trait and enchant, sturdy tri-stat. If you've got full sturdy tri-stat gear, that'll get you through every piece of content in the game, pretty much. You're not going to have any issues doing virtually anything with sturdy tri-stat. In terms of jewelry preference, again, I absolutely love triune jewelry. So triune jewelry, magica recovery, and then sturdy tri-stat. That is my setup. That is my perfect setup, because it gives me ridiculous stats. I get great recovery, great sustain, great build to play, especially for main tanking. You could use infused jewelry. Again, you'd probably use magica recovery. And that's pretty much it. So sturdy tri-stat. If you can't afford tri-stat, then go like stamina body, magica weapons and jewelry. Magica small pieces, stamina big pieces, and then all points into health on your attributes. That's a good way to kind of build it in a similar way to tri-stat, but without the cost. And it's not as good, but it's another kind of way to balance out stats in a good way. So just go all points into health, Small pieces magicka, big pieces stamina, and that'll give you a good result as well. But yeah, any advice on Vas +2 main tanking and keeping Lothis on Olms's tail? This is a strategy that people used when Vas first came out 5 years ago or whatever it was. No one does that anymore because it's ineffective, it's inefficient, it doesn't work well doing it that way. What's happening is, if the main tank is taking Lothis, you're basically carrying the off tank because the off tank is doing nothing. They might as well not even be there because you might as well just get a damage dealer to taunt Felms because it's nice and easy. So the only people now in the game who still use this strategy for Vas +2 where the main tank takes Lothis is people on Xbox NA. There's no one else in the game that does this strategy. I don't know why Xbox NA are still clinging on to the past of using that strategy, but it's way more efficient to have the off tank stacking Lothis and Felms. The reason why is because the off tank can move around freely a lot of the fight. When Felms is jumping, they can taunt and stack Lothis. And like, there's loads of opportunity to do that. When the main tank is taunting Lothis, what I don't understand is the way that this works is the off tank taunts Lothis at the start, brings it in, and then the main tank takes over and taunts it. Then what happens is Lothis will keep teleporting away and then running back to the main boss. Now, if it's to the left or the right of the main boss, it's impossible for the main tank to stack it. So it's never stacked if it teleports to the left or right of the main boss. The only time it stacks is if it teleports to the opposite side of the room, so where the group healer is. That's the only time it will kind of work. But the problem is you can also lose taunt. If the main tank loses taunt, they can't run and get it back. So there's so many things wrong with this strategy. If the main tank loses taunt, like if it teleports away, then it needs interrupting, then it goes and does its cone AoE, that's going to take longer than 15 seconds, so you're going to have lost taunt of the boss. Then how do you get it back? Well, the off tank has to taunt it, drag it in, and then you take it back again. It just doesn't make sense. There's no logic behind making the main tank taunt Lothis as well as Olms, because it just doesn't work. And the thing as well is, if you want to stack Lothis in a good way, that it gets good cleave damage, you need it to be in the tail, not on the edge of the tail, and that's where it goes to when you have your main tank taunting it. It will go like on the edge of the tail. It's not stacked very well. It's not very close. So your group have to like fan out a bit further backwards. Whereas in that situation, you want your group to be nice and compact onto St. Olms so they've got more room to kite. And they're not able to do that because they can't cleave Lothis from that position because it doesn't stack very well. So the off tank can stack it right where it needs to be, right in the tail, close to the boss's ass, let's say. That's where it kind of needs to be, because you want to be in a good position where everything's taking damage at the same time. If the boss is nowhere near the actual hitbox of the boss where it takes damage, then you're not getting any cleave. You're only attacking the boss, and then there's no cleave damage on the ad. Or people are focusing the ad, and the boss ain't getting any cleave damage. So the main tank shouldn't taunt it. Just get the off tank to do it. And I know people are going to criticize that theory if you're an Xbox NA player and that's what you do. However, there's no logic behind it. It doesn't work. It doesn't make sense. I've never seen anyone pull this off successfully because the off tank keeps having to help taunt Lothis, and then the off tank is doing nothing. So the main tank is trying to keep up stagger and blockade and taunt, debuffs and buffs and everything on the boss. How can they do that when they have to keep chasing after Lothis to try and taunt it? It doesn't work. The off tank standing there doing nothing. They might as well be taunting Lothis, because when Felms isn't there, or like Felms is jumping or Felms is dead, then they're standing there doing nothing. So if you are not making your off tank taunt Lothis, you are carrying the off tank. You might as well have charged them 4 million gold and made it worth your while, because it doesn't make any sense. So that is how you keep Lothis on the tail. You don't. You get the off tank to do it. Okay, last question that we've got on the list here. I'm new to off tanking, Necro tank. Now I'm asked to wear PA and Worm, so I'll tank in medium armor. You never did. I wanted to know if you have any tips for me or things that I must be aware of. Another thing that I should do is brittle in the future, which is also new to me. How do I maintain that correctly? So PA and Worm is a good off-tank setup in certain situations. So in this particular situation, I believe this person is going into VMO and they're going to be wearing medium armor. Now, this is one of the places where it is absolutely fine to do so, because you've got the first boss where you may or may not ever have to taunt it. So you might have to taunt the main boss, the first boss, in VMO, but chances are that you won't have to taunt it once or twice, and you only taunt it for a couple of seconds. You just do a quick taunt, and then there you go. So medium armor tanking isn't an issue for VMO, because that trial was created when people were around 300 CP on the old CP system, and it's never been updated since either. So the damage is still super low. The trial is still the same as it was 4-5 years ago, maybe longer than that now. So the damage is low. Things that kill you are one-shots that you can't avoid. So people blowing each other up. When it comes to the twins, I've tanked the twins multiple times in medium armor, doing a brittle setup and all that kind of stuff, and it's not even an issue. The twins fight doesn't actually, that boss doesn't do any damage. The only thing that causes damage are the ads. When you've got loads of ads and they're all hitting you at the same time, people aren't interrupting the ads. If you stand in the negate for too long, if somebody runs into you and kills you, those are the things that are a problem. It's not the actual boss damage. The light attacks from the boss don't really do anything. You could always dodge roll the heavy if you wanted to. You will go out of position if you do that, but it's really up to you. So generally, wearing PA on the body is not that bad at all. Especially now. So nowadays, in CP 2.0, wearing 5 medium and 2 heavy is equivalent in terms of the incoming damage to wearing 511 on the old CP system at 810 CP. So it's more than acceptable to be using PA body for trials like the Craglorn trials, for VMOL, certain other situations. So some people do it in VSS. On like the Locust East fight, they might run PA and Alkosh. In other places as well, like VHOF. The third boss in VHOF, you don't even need a second tank. On the second boss, you're kiting an ad around. So there are a lot of situations where running medium body is perfectly acceptable, and it's not a problem at all. Now, if you are a bit scared of running medium body, you could always use the medium armor skill. So something like the elude skill, that will reduce your damage that you take from AoE effects and things like that. So if you are dealing with some damage, you can just use that skill to kind of help you out. And that it does make a big impact if you use it. So if you are using medium armor, you can use that skill. You can still have really, really high stats in a medium armor build. If you go Triune Jewelry, Tri-Stat, Sturdy Gear, you're still going to be at like 40k health. You're still going to have 25k plus stamina and stuff like that. So you still end up with a really insane build, even in medium armor. Now, medium armor tanking won't work everywhere. Like, you're not going to start medium armor tanking Rock Grove on the first boss. There's just too much damage. But you can medium armor tank something like Kind's Aegis, because if you're the off tank, you don't actually ever taunt anything. So you're mostly just in that fight as like a support player. You're not actually a tank, really, because you don't have to taunt anything. You don't have any enemies to take a lot of the time. So you can play it safely, even though it's a hard-hitting trial. So yeah, you've just got to look at the situation. Medium armor tanking is perfectly acceptable in situations where the damage is super low or really old content. And like I say, it's very comparable to a couple of patches ago. Like, medium armor tanking is the same as wearing heavy a few patches ago. So it's not going to be a big deal at all. And especially next patch, if the CP goes live that's on the PTS currently, when you're blocking, that 20% extra block mitigation is just absolutely crazy good. So if you're in medium armor and you block, it's going to reduce the damage by loads. So you're not going to have any issues at all, especially with the new CP coming next patch. And in terms of brittle, the way to maintain brittle, I've done a whole video on this. I've got a whole like guide on maintaining brittle and how to do it. So typically, you need a double frost staff setup. You would need to put frost blockade back bar with an infused weapon and a frost glyph front bar. You use a charged front bar, sorry, and that way you put down your blockade on your back bar with your infused frost glyph. And then you go onto your front bar and you stay on your front bar, and because of the charge staff, that will pretty much activate it 100% of the time. By doing that, you can easily keep like over 95% brittle just by doing that setup with your staves. Now you can like bring in other things. You can use pulsar with a frost staff, a charged frost staff, and that will give you brittle as an AoE like instantly. You just press it, boom, everything around you's got AoE brittle. So there's loads of different ways to set up for brittle though. Like there's loads and loads and loads of different ways you can set up brittle. And you've just got to kind of, it's got to work for your group. You've got to work it into your group. You've got to find out what your group's using, how you're going to work in brittle. Are you going to be able to use a double frost staff setup? Are you going to run a certain gear set or this, that, and the other? There are loads of different things to consider. So it's difficult with such minuscule information about the situation to know how we're going to manage it. But yeah, generally, just your staves. It's all about the staves. Blockade, frost glyph, and kind of double frost staff, and that's pretty much sorting you out. Okay. Well, that's all the questions I've got on my list, guys. Thanks for that.